Good afternoon. I'm excited tonight to introduce our speaker. And Tim Coleman comes from Man and New Start Church, and we're just so proud of him. And he's in his second year at Trevecca, and he has a call upon his life. He has had it for a while to be in the ministry, and he is called to be a youth pastor, and that's what he's studying. And we're so proud of him. I remember he told me not to make it gooky, so I'm going to try not to. But I remember when he was just so small, and you could just always sense that there was something special about him, that God had a plan. And he was so determined to follow that plan. And that's so hard in the world we live in with the peer pressure and in school and I imagine even in the college. But he was always, it seemed like it came easy to him because he knew that God had a plan for him. So he's here for Christmas break, and he's going to bring the message to us. And let's welcome him tonight. Come on, Tim.
All right, is it? Yeah, it's working. And as for avoiding peer pressure, I think part of it might have just been because I was stubborn. And so it was kind of hard for me to be swayed, per se. So bear with me. I'm a little new to this still. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 14, and I believe he's going to have it up on the screen. Here we'll be looking at the beginning of Moses' life. Before we read, let's bow our heads in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I'd like to thank you for this day and this opportunity that I have to come before these people and to preach and teach your word that you have passed down to us. And I just thank you again for the opportunity for everyone to be gathered here, for the chance that we do have to hear the word, and the ease that we are able to hear it. And I just ask that you be with me and guide my words that I may fulfill your will. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. These are the names of the son of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob. No. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. The birth of Moses. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that, he saw no one. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." So here we see the beginning of the life of Moses. And to give some background, which I didn't read about, Pharaoh had the Israelites enslaved under him, but they still had God's blessing, and they were multiplying. They were growing in number extremely quick. And Pharaoh began to be afraid that if they continued to grow like this so rapidly, that they would rise up and possibly revolt against him. So in order to try and prevent this, he he decreed that any of his midwives, whenever they were to go and assist the Hebrew women in giving birth to the children, that if it was a male, they were to kill it. But if it was a female, they would allow it to live. Now, unfortunately for Pharaoh, fortunately for us, the midwives feared the Lord. And so they would not kill the babies and told Pharaoh that they simply were not able to make it there in time for the birth. So then Pharaoh, in response to this, decrees that to all of the Israelites, if any male is born, he is to be thrown into the Nile. And if it is a female, for them to live. So this is where we find Moses. This law has been decreed, and his mother has given birth to him, and she hides him while she can. So we're going to come over to another story. So for a while now, I've been a very avid carpenter. I've always liked working with my hands and liked working with wood. So it started with just me building tables and stuff like that for around the house, but then I finally just started to go into more of an artistic design or whatever. So one of my ideas was to carve a rose for my girlfriend for Valentine's Day. But I decided what would make it even better was if instead of me just going out and buying this wood, if I were to actually go and chop down a tree and carve it from that. So I went out, I got my axe, quite well versed in the use of an axe. Pastor Mike can attest to that. So I went and I did some research, because I didn't want to use just any tree. I wanted to use a good tree. I found an ash tree that was in our yard, which is a fairly hard-wooded tree. Chopped it down and forgot about it for a little while. Came back and then proceeded to chop it into pieces that I would then use for carving the rose. I chopped it into more manageable pieces so that I would be able to take it in my building, because this is a pretty big tree. I wasn't going to carry the whole thing inside. But that whole process was me preparing to make the rose. I got the idea, the drive, I wanted to make a rose, and then so I went about preparing how I was going to do that. So then we come back over here. The Israelites are oppressed. They've been enslaved by Pharaoh, and now they're even further trying to be even more oppressed by Pharaoh by the killing of their sons so that they cannot continue to reproduce. And so God begins to set in motion with the birth of Moses, who would later go on to free the Israelites. So we look at the first, go to verse 1 or verse 3. This was after the mother could no longer hide him, so 3 months after Moses was born. He's now 3 months old. She says, "But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch and placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile." Now this, I found, was a very impactful verse, because I was doing some research and I found that the symbolism or the foreshadowing to Jesus in here. See, the Nile represented the death of the child. Like, that was the tool used to kill the children, to suppress the Israelites. And yet, here's Moses now floating over the Nile, using it as his means of living, which eventually became the means for the Israelites to be freed. Just as Jesus, our God, used the cross, which was supposed to symbolize death, and what Satan viewed as his victory eventually became his downfall, and the freeing of all of mankind through the use of the cross. The same for the ark. It floated over the waters that were meant to kill so many, but the few that were faithful survived through that. So here we see the preparation. We see God preparing this person, and it's not a quick process. I mean, it started when Moses was a baby. He was just born. There was the pressure, the motion, the instigation by Pharaoh's decree to kill all of the Israelite males that began and set this plan in motion. And it started with Moses, who was then found, of all people, Pharaoh's daughter. And here we think, so he's now floating over the Nile that was meant to be death for all of his people, all of his kind. And then he comes, the Pharaoh's daughter herself comes across it, the daughter of the one who had decreed that all of the males should be killed. And yet, she finds mercy, or has mercy on him, and is moved by compassion to bring him into her house. And even goes and gets the mother of the child to nurse him. And if that's not God delivering, then she trusted and protected her child, and by doing that she got to have her child and be with him completely free of harm, and even got paid for it. So here we see God preparing. There was the motion, then God began preparing the lives of those around him, or the lives of those in the world, to be ready to live out or to enact his freeing of the Israelites. So, did all this chopping, got the tree down. Took me a little while to get the tree down. I got it chopped up, got it inside, and then that day after I chopped it up and got it in there, I went through the process of picking out the pieces that I thought would be the best to use, because there were some that had a little bit of damage from insects, like there were holes in certain spots, so I had to do some trimming. I had to carve it down a little bit, cut off the excess, and get it small enough for me to work with. By the end of the day, I had finally gotten to a small piece, and roughly the shape of a rose. It was sort of the shape, too tall, too big, still rough, but it had been a long day, so I decided to call it there. So I put it away in the building, went up into my room, ate dinner, went to sleep, and the next day I got up early because I thought I'll go and get I'll get up early and get started on this as soon as I can to get it done. So I go out there, and I pick up the rough rose, the piece of wood, and I'm looking at it, and I start to work with it a little bit, and then I happen to look at the top. And in the top of it, there is this huge crack. And not just a crack on the side that I maybe could have trimmed off or worked with. It was directly through the middle, practically splitting the rose in half. And so I was like devastated when that happened, because I'd put so much work. I'd spent all day yesterday working on it, only to have it crack. And this was nothing I could do to fix that. It was way too detrimental for me to actually be able to repair it. So, not being, as I said, I'm stubborn, so I didn't give up after that. I went and got another piece and started working with that one. And finally, I got farther than I did the day before, because I didn't have to chop up the wood or anything. I already had it chopped down. I took the piece, and I actually got it pretty much the size of a rose. Started working in the top a little bit to show the petals, and by the end of the day, I was pretty happy with it. So I, again, set it down in my building, expecting surely this can't happen again. Go inside, go to sleep, come out the next morning, and rush out there to see, hoping the rose was still intact. I pick it up, and to my dismay, again, there is a huge crack straight through the middle of the rose. And so now I'm just like flustered. I have no idea what to do. I've just decided that I can't use this piece again. I'm running out of wood because not all the pieces were able to be used. So, in my dismay, after I'd gathered myself, I did what every teenager does. I Googled it. So I went and looked up about curing wood, or about using wood that had, like a tree that just been tied down. What I found out was that, it should have been obvious, the wood itself is moist. It's wet. It has sap in it. It's got fluid in it. Even after it's chopped down, that remains in it, and it dries out. If it dries too fast, which can happen if you chop it up and separate it, if it's not given a long time to dry, like most of the big places use a huge, like a humidifying chamber, but if it's not given enough time to cure, or if it cures too quickly from being chopped into small pieces, it will crack, and it's completely cracked down the middle. It becomes brittle, and the particles separate from each other. So, now that I finally knew what was wrong, I had to go about of trying to figure out how to avoid this problem, and I found out that if I put it in a plastic bag, sometimes that prevents it from drying out so quickly. And so what I ended up doing, I got a piece, I cut it down to about the size of the rose, and I put it in the bag, and I prayed. The next day, I woke up. I was going to wait a while. The next day I woke up, it was intact. So I waited another day. It was still intact. And then so I started to work on the rose. Here we have Moses. He's just now been, we're going to come in where he's finally old enough to go to Pharaoh. He no longer needs to be nursed. And he's brought in as Pharaoh's daughter. So we're at verse 10. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. On that day, after Moses had grown up, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Now, I find that interesting that it took so long that clearly, I don't think that there were years and years where there was no mistreatment of slaves. To me, it was probably pretty common for that to happen, especially for the Pharaoh's particular despise of the Israelites, with them growing so rapidly and him trying to hold down their numbers. So there must have been something, a shift in Moses' view that brought it to sight. That could have been God, that could have been him simply deciding one day or moving out of the palace, moving out of his pampered life, because being the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, he had some benefits. Even if he was not literally her son, he still led a pretty good life. But he went outside. He happened to go outside and see this action that took place. And glancing this way and that, and seeing no one, this is verse 12, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Here's Moses taking this action into his own hand. This whole time we've been seeing God preparing him, God, just this time passing by as Moses is being brought into Pharaoh's household, being made into this into the tool that are made to where God could use him. But then here at this point, we see we see Moses taking things into his own hands. He sees the pain of his people, and it becomes personal that way. And he strikes out and kills this Hebrew man. And thinking honestly, probably to himself, that he did a good deed, this not Hebrew man, Egyptian man. Thinking probably that he did something good. His people were being oppressed, and he stood up for those people, even though he had been living in Pharaoh's house, living all pampered, while his people were out there suffering just for food to eat. So, verse 13. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." So right there, that's like me, where I came out after the work I did on my rows. I was so excited, I came out again, began to work on it, and saw the crack. Saw where something had gone wrong and did not go as I had expected. Moses did this action that he knew was a crime, but at the time was either an act of rage, or perhaps he even felt that he was doing justice for his people. So he comes out, and he goes to these Hebrews, and probably was with a slight sense of arrogance or a slight sense of pride that I had done this protecting my people. And then he sees the two of them fighting, and it amazes him that these two people these two same people, both Hebrews, while they're being oppressed, instead of standing together, are fighting one another. And he asks them, "Why are you doing this?" And they look at him and look on him with distaste for the action he had done, where he had killed the Egyptian, and ask, "Are you going to kill us too?" And they ask, "Who made you the judge over us?" Essentially, who made you the judge to decide whether something is right or wrong, or whether someone should be killed? So after that, Moses, seeing this crack, this fault, leaves, because he's broken. Everything, he knows now that he's a criminal. Clearly what he's done is known. It's not hidden. And so he fears for his life, and he runs. But thankfully, that's not where the story ends. Because unlike me, who cannot fix cracks, who, if a crack is large enough, if it's so big in this piece of wood, I can't fix that. I can't make it go away. I cannot work with that. But unlike me, God, there is nothing God cannot fix. There is no crack that God runs away from because he's too afraid of it or because he is unable to fix it. If anything, God used this moment. Even though it was Moses' action, his preparation for Moses would have kept going, but because Moses did this, now he had this fear and he had this break in his life where he lost everything he had. And so there was a hitch in the plan of Moses. And it makes me think of how often we do that. how often, how much easier I think some things would be if we would simply sit back and let God take control. Because I think that we make so much more trouble trying to do something ahead of time. I remember all the time, my grandma would tell me, wait, I'll help you when I get there, and we'll get it done. And I'm like, I don't need to wait on her. And I go and I do it anyway and end up breaking something. And then I either have to hide it or somehow just face up to the fact that I failed and I broke it. And so Moses is here. He's broken, he's cracked, and he runs. But God is not done there yet. He brings Moses out, and if anything, like I said, this humbles Moses. The fact that his own decision was considered wrong and, in fact, led to him having to flee was extremely a humbling opportunity. Like I said, when he came out that day afterwards, he was probably prideful. He was probably thinking, look at me, I'm standing up for my people. I did a great good for them. And then is amazed by the fact that they look at him with distaste. So he's humbled. And it is in that state of humbling where God can really use us, where God can either use us, or at that point when we are humbled, it's where we are able, or where God is able to change us, because he's not going to do it unwillingly. We have to be willing to accept that change. If we're so stuck in our ways and think that we're always right, it's like having blinders on. We can't see what's going on around us, or these other things that could be done. And there's no swaying us in that. But when we are humbled, we are able to be changed by God, to be broken by him, and to be formed into what it is that he wants. I'm going to turn to 1 Corinthians. It's not going to be up there, but that's just a small part. 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. This is Paul writing to the church in Corinth. And to me, this is supposed to be an extremely humbling experience for the church of Corinth. Brothers, this is verse 1. Brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly. Isn't that something you want to hear? Here we are, this church that has been built up and has been doing all these things that thinks they are following the ways that they should. And in the very first line of this chapter is, brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly. Mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not yet ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? Here again we see the word ready that I've been using so many. These people here believed they were ready. They thought they were ready, just as Moses thought that he was ready to stand up for his people. But here Paul is telling them that they are nowhere near ready. They're not even up to solid food yet, that he gave them milk because they were not ready. They were like infants in Christ. They had not even learned yet to walk. And yet, so that's why here in the next part, he this is 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 18. I don't know why I turned. 18 through 19. Do not deceive yourselves. If any one of you thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool, so that he may be wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. So here we see Paul telling the church in Corinth that they need to break and humble themselves. They may consider themselves wise by the standards of the world, but that's not what God views as wise. For his wisdom far surpasses, or his lack of whatever. Anyway, I can't remember. But he's telling them that they need to be humbled. They need to back down so that God can do what it is that he wants to do in their lives. Because if they do not allow him to work and prepare them, they're not going to be ready. They're going to cause cracks. They're going to cause brokenness, just like Moses did when he killed that Egyptian man. They're going to hit walls. They're going to make adversities for themselves by not allowing God to do his timing and his work. So what does this have to do with us completely? Well, as I said earlier, we often, at least I know, I'm a fixer. I like to think that I can do things myself without God's help or without anyone else's help. And it often leads to a lot of trouble and a lot of disheartening, a lot of pain. That arrogance leads us to fall, leads us to cause problems, to run into adversities. Because God, I believe it says it, I don't remember. God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and he uses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. It is in that state, as Paul said, that in my weakness you are made strong, that he would gladly be weak for that more of God's work can be shown through his life, through who he is and through what he does, because he's pointing back to God. There is no way that he could have done this on his own. So this just shows us the importance of being lesser, or of thinking, or putting ourselves not on such huge pedestals so that we think that we are the big shot and the one that can do everything. This reminds me of Samson, of the story of Samson, where he was a great warrior, and with that I'm sure came a lot of pride and a lot of misthought of where his power came from. And in the end, his own failure led him to be captured by the Pharisees, or not the Pharisees, that's not, captured by, anyway, the Philistines. Captured by the Philistines, and yet, while he's there, while he's broken, he reaches out to God. It is in this moment of his weakness, where he's blind and half dead. His eyes have been gouged out, he's been beaten, he's been in prison for so long, that he reaches back out to God in that weakness and asks him to grant him his strength one more time. And in that one action, he kills more of the Philistines than he did in his whole life. He does more work in that weak moment, in that weak state where he was completely broken, than he did as an entire prideful life running around killing people with the jawbone of a donkey. So, in closing, this just reminds me of a devotion, a quote from a devotion that I read years ago that has just stuck with me. And it says, "In order to burn brightly, our lives must first experience the flame." Now, when I first read this, I thought it meant that we had to, I think one meaning I got from it was that in order for us to do what it is that God wants us to do, in order for us to be great, we must first experience adversities. We must first go through these trials and these problems so that it builds character, it builds endurance, which then continues on and makes character. But then I looked at it in more of a symbolic way from reading this, or from talking about this. It makes me think of a blacksmith. When a blacksmith goes and creates a tool, he doesn't just take it and heat it up and then form it into what he needs it to be and give it away. There's much more that goes into that. He continues exposing it to the flame. He shows it the flame and cools it and shows it the flame continuously until it is tempered, until it is strong enough or well fit to do the job that it is supposed to do. Because if you took a little nail, it wouldn't do the same job as what the metal for a sword is supposed to do. Because it needs to be the sword needs to be stronger, it needs to be more tempered. And so that enduring process takes a long time. Like, to get something extremely hard, you have to heat it hundreds of times and cool it over and over again. So in that same way, God takes us, our lives, and has to work with it and mold it over and over again so that we become what it is that he needs us to be. And it doesn't help that we fight him most of the time, that he has to continue struggling with us in order to achieve what it is that he wants us to do in our lives. So, just what I want to really take from this is that God is always working in everyone's lives. He has a plan for each and every one of us. He has a goal that we are to achieve. And it may not be being a missionary in Africa. It may not be being the president of some huge Christian university. But whatever it is, God has a plan for you both to do that and both to prepare you for that job so that you are able to do that work that he wants you to do. So just be open to anything that may come and be patient. Patience is very key because it takes a long time to really be formed and to build the character that he needs and to build the skills that God needs in us. Thank you. Hand it over to Miss Donna.